Despite the 15th Amendment's prohibition against racial discrimination in voting, Southern states were relentless in passing laws and policies restricting the ability of African Americans to vote. One of the more insidious ways in which they did this was known as the white primary. In order to be elected to most offices in the United States, someone must win two elections. First, the primary election, and then the general election. First, both the Democratic and Republican parties hold primary elections, usually in the spring. In primary elections, members of each party vote to select their party's nominee. Then, the winner of each primary faces off against the other in the general election, held in November. Today, states in the South are dominated by Republicans, but that wasn't always the case. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, and he freed the slaves. As a result, white Southerners held a grudge against the Republican Party for more than a century. From the 1870s to the 1990s, the South was known as the Solid South because Democrats won virtually every elective office in every Southern state. They typically won the general election with 80 to 90% of the vote. This led to an interesting situation. Because the South was so heavily Democratic, it barely mattered which candidate the Republican Party nominated, because the Democratic candidate was virtually guaranteed to win the general election in November. As a result, the general election was pretty unimportant, since the outcome was never in doubt. Therefore, the most important election was the Democratic primary election, because whoever won the Democratic primary was almost guaranteed to win in the general election. But the Democratic Party passed internal rules and regulations saying that only white people were allowed to participate in their primary election. This meant that black people were allowed to vote in the general election, but that election didn't really matter very much, because the Democrat was guaranteed to win. Black people were not allowed to vote in the only election that really mattered, the Democratic primary. Thus, these came to be known as white primaries. The 15th Amendment prohibits racial discrimination in voting, and it clearly applies to the November general election. But Democrats argued that the 15th Amendment didn't apply to primary elections because political parties are private organizations that are not a part of the government. The Supreme Court confronted this issue in the 1944 case of Smith v. Allwright. In an 8-1 decision, the court declared white primaries to be unconstitutional. They found that while political parties may be private organizations, they are closely connected to state government. Primary elections are conducted by the party under state statutory authority. The privilege of membership in a party may be no concern of a state. But when, as here, that privilege is also the essential qualification for voting in a primary to select nominees for a general election, the state makes the action of the party the action of the state. The United States is a constitutional democracy. Its organic law grants to all citizens a right to participate in the choice of elected officials without restriction by any state because of race. This grant to the people of the opportunity for choice is not to be nullified by a state through casting its electoral process in a form which permits a private organization to practice racial discrimination in the election. Constitutional rights would be of little value if they could be thus indirectly denied. So this decision eliminated one common method of disenfranchising black voters, but there were many others, as discussed in other videos. And since the 1990s, the positions of the two parties in the South have switched. The Republican Party now dominates in the South. And Democrats now support civil rights, while Republicans oppose them.